It's much more than a beginning than an end. It's much more of a beginning than an end. The $148 million verdict in Rudy Giuliani's election worker civil defamation case. The former New York mayor has vowed to appeal the nine-figure ruling, but the road ahead is bigger than that. For starters, less than an hour ago, we learned that attorneys for Ruby Freeman and Shaye Moss filed a new complaint against Giuliani, seeking an injunction. We'll tell you about what that means in a moment. But what about Donald Trump himself? If Giuliani is guilty of defaming two innocent people, knowingly spreading lies at their expense, is the disgraced ex-president as well? After all, the January 6th Select Committee clearly illustrated the way that Trump targeted Ruby Freeman and Shaye Moss in the aftermath of the election. This was the crowd in Valdosta, Georgia, at a Trump rally on December the 5th, 2020. Remember, this was after the election. What they're doing is watching the video, incorrectly purporting to show Moss and Freeman engaged in election fraud. And after that, this is what Trump said.
So, if you just take the crime of what those Democrat workers were doing, and by the way, there was no water main break. You know, they said there was no water main break. That's 10 times more than I need to win this state. 10 times more. It's 10 times, maybe more than that, but it's 10 times more because we lost by a very close number.
And beyond the scope of civil litigation, what sort of overlap exists between the Giuliani ruling and Trump's criminal case in Fulton County, Georgia? Trump mentioned Ruby Freeman 18 times on that infamous Find Me 11,000 Votes call with Georgia Secretary of State Brad Raffensperger, after all. So what's next? Joining our conversation, former assistant U.S. attorney and former candidate for mayor of New York City, Maya Wiley. Andrew's also back with us. Andrew, let me ask you that question, because Rudy Giuliani, I don't know what the language is to use. Some would say, in non-legal terms, he sort of defaulted on that case because he didn't do what he was supposed to do, so he was found responsible. And the trial that occurred was basically about the fees, the penalties he would pay. That said, the same allegations are in the Georgia criminal indictment, and he's not the only one that faces them. So what's the relationship between what happened in the civil trial and what's going to happen in Georgia?
Sure. So first, to the criminal case, Ruby Freeman and Shaye Moss, their testimony is completely integral to some of the criminal charges brought by the state of Georgia. They're specifically focused on in terms of what Rudy Giuliani and other people did in terms of damaging and harassing them. So they will certainly be witnesses. And Rudy Giuliani, in addition to this civil case where there was the judgment last week, is facing criminal charges in connection with what he did with respect to them. It is also part of the criminal case that Jack Smith has brought federally in D.C., where allegations with respect to Ruby Freeman and Shaye Moss are also part of that larger scheme. And then finally, to your question about Donald Trump, I can understand, and by the way, in our podcast, we actually asked the lead lawyer about that. Why did you not sue Donald Trump and why just Rudy Giuliani? And it's important to remember that if you're focusing on a case for something that the former president did while he was in office, that could delay seeking relief because there are issues of presidential immunity. However, statements that Donald Trump made after he left office, and I believe there are some, could form the basis of a civil case in addition to all the other liability that he is facing. In the same way, for instance, E. Jean Carroll has brought suit in connection with defamation and statements made by Donald Trump when he was no longer the president and thus does not have a claim of presidential immunity.
Right. This is an important distinction because in the time that those phone calls were made or those things were done, with some exceptions, because Rudy Giuliani kept doing this long after Donald Trump wasn't president, but Rudy Giuliani wasn't president of anything. Donald Trump was. Maya, let's put up the $148 million damages and see how they break down. $16 million to Freeman for defamation, $17 million to Moss for defamation, then emotional distress. You're a New Yorker. Rudy Giuliani does this. He is a guy who has wrecked people's reputation for a living. Back when he was U.S. attorney, when he was mayor, this is his thing. When people talk about the fall of Rudy Giuliani into this sort of mess that he's become, there are many people from this city who say Rudy Giuliani was always some version of this guy.
Rudy Giuliani could always be a knee basher.
Yeah.
Let's put it that way. He was not gentle with his words or his action. But the Rudy Giuliani that was a U.S. attorney in a preeminent office that I was privileged to work in the civil side, one that values its reputation in the Department of Justice, did not bring cases without evidence. This is a Rudy Giuliani who made statements calling two public servants, the same man who defends public servants who are police officers. These women were public servants too. Lots of history from Rudy Giuliani being mayor. There were accusations that he was not sensitive to people of color and black people in particular. I'm being polite. But that here the pattern is he used what I consider to be racist, stereotypical tropes against two public servants doing their job. And he was willing, both in their case, also in cases across the country, willing to make allegations of conduct that would be a crime as a former top federal prosecutor for the government, without evidence. And to your point, to the question you asked, Andrew, it was absolutely that Rudy Giuliani said, yes, I agree that my statements were false and what we call defamation per se. All that means is anybody would know when you call somebody a drug dealer, a hustler, and say they're stealing an election, it's defamatory. That is a totally different picture.